and welcome to the March 9th, 2026 City Council work session. Thank you for joining us in this hybrid meeting format. For work sessions like this one, there is no opportunity for public comment, and those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcasts and meetings materials page of the City of Eugene website. In case of a medical emergency, an automated external defibrillator, an AED, is located on the counter behind staff to your left on the west side of this room. And in case of an emergency evacuation, emergency exits are through the double doors located at the back of the room, and the patio doors can also be used as needed. Thank you again for joining us this evening. I now call the March 9th, 2026 work session of the Eugene City Council to order. And I will turn it over to our city manager to introduce our first topic, a work session on home energy score policy discussion.
Thank you, Mayor. This is part 2 of our conversation on home energy score. This will focus on the policy piece of the discussion. You have the opportunity for action if that's what you'd like to do tonight. And we have Danielle Klinkabel and Ian Penn from our sustainability program here with us, and I will hand it off to them.
Good evening, City Council. I am Danielle Klinkabel, and I'm a climate policy analyst in the sustainability program. And joining me tonight is Ian Penn, the sustainability manager. This is the second of 2 work sessions focusing on a proposed home energy score disclosure policy. At the first work session 2 weeks ago, staff provided an overview of the home energy score tool and policy and summarized community engagement and research findings. Tonight, I will quickly run through that again and then share key considerations for potential adoption, including cost estimates and possible approaches for funding the program, a regulatory framework, and an implementation plan should Council decide to proceed. Council may decide to take action tonight to direct the City Manager to draft an ordinance. So briefly, last work session, I talked about the challenges and opportunities regarding energy use in Eugene's housing stock. Council has established a decarbonization goal to reduce the carbon impact of homes, as well as to improve their energy efficiency. Previous engagement has shown that many people are unaware of how to improve their home's energy efficiency and help staff identify 2 top community priorities listed here on the slide. Expanding the use of home energy scores is one pathway to help achieve these priorities. Previous City Council direction has directed the City Manager to explore a policy that would require you to disclose a home energy score when selling a home. These 2 motions direct staff to do community engagement, develop a draft ordinance framework, identify potential funding sources, and create an implementation roadmap. There is one more motion that directs the City Manager to develop options for renters. Staff are currently focused on developing the policy for home sales first because it is a much more straightforward pathway. So just a quick refresher on the home energy score tool. It is a standardized tool developed by the U.S. Department of Energy to evaluate a variety of physical and mechanical features throughout the home and provide a score on a scale of 1 to 10 based on the energy use of that home. You can think of this like a miles per gallon rating for a car. The report also includes energy cost estimates, recommendations for how to improve the score, and links to incentives like rebates, tax credits, and loans. Again, here is some information pulled from a sample score showing how this home scored. Again, the score isn't a reflection of whether a home is bad or good. It simply indicates how much energy that home uses. Here are some of the recommended improvements, many of which are eligible for incentives. Many other cities, including 4 in Oregon, have implemented a home energy score disclosure requirement. The way this requirement works is the seller of a home would get a home energy score before they advertise the home for sale. They would include the home energy score report in the MLS database, and then any prospective buyer can view the report as they look at homes on Zillow, Redfin, et cetera. In terms of policy goals, again, I went over these last time, but there are 3 primary goals of the policy. The first is to increase transparency by providing clear, consistent information about home energy use and costs. The second goal is to educate homeowners and buyers about opportunities to improve energy efficiency. And finally, to connect homeowners to resources and incentives to help finance upgrades. Many of these goals align with other council priorities. So again, this is a tool that continues to move the ball down the field with these priorities. So last work session, I provided an in-depth overview of the engagement and research that was conducted. Those reports are included as attachments E and F in your packet. In summary, staff engaged roughly 630 people. We really tried to be creative so we could engage a wide range of people. In addition to engagement, we hired Earth Advantage to look at existing research and other cities that have implemented the policy to understand best practices and observed impacts, as well as housing trends in Eugene. Engagement and research was distilled into the following 6 themes. Both engagement and research reinforced that this policy would increase transparency in the real estate market and support buyers in making a more informed purchase. Second, the policy would lead to greater uptake of energy efficiency incentives and completion of energy improvement projects, with research indicating that homes that have done a home energy score can be up to 8 to 23% more likely to pursue projects. There were many concerns about the impact on housing prices, but research indicates that disclosure has only been associated with modest price differences for higher scoring homes, often reflecting the projected energy cost savings. There were some concerns about the policy having operational impacts on the real estate market, such as delays or redundancy. These outcomes haven't been observed in other cities where the policy is implemented. In terms of the policy's impact on climate and emissions, there is limited emissions reductions from a disclosure-only requirement, though greater reductions are possible when homeowners pursue recommended upgrades. And there are various elements related to how the policy would be implemented that were brought up throughout engagement and research. Again, this provides a quick summary from our engagement and research with more details in your packet. And now I will hand it over to Ian to talk about some of the funding implications of this requirement.
Thank you, Danielle, and good evening, Mayor and Council. Again, I'm Ian Penn, and I'm the Sustainability Manager. So I was going to begin with estimated non-personnel costs if Council chooses to move forward with the disclosure requirements, and more information on this is found in Appendix C. These estimates have been informed by experience in other Oregon cities with disclosure requirements and has been scaled to Eugene, both our population and our housing market. In the first year, costs would largely relate to startup activities, so things like establishing reporter and data systems, coordinating with MLS workflows, and ensuring assessors are trained and available before any requirement would take effect. If Council chose to prioritize equity measures, such as free or subsidized scores for income-qualified households, that would also represent a program cost. After the initial year, ongoing costs are lower and mostly relate to things like maintaining systems, updating communication materials, and continuing any subsidy programs. The other primary cost category would be staffing. These are also based on experience gathered from other Oregon cities, and staff estimate that administering the program would require approximately half an FTE. The majority of that time would be focused on program administration, so things like monitoring listings to ensure disclosure has occurred, issuing reminder notices when needed, and responding to questions from sellers, real estate professionals, and community members. And finally, some staff capacity would be used for data tracking and reporting, which will allow the city to understand trends in the housing stock and monitor program performance over time. The estimated cost for that half FTE is approximately $70,000 to $90,000 annually, and that reflects the fully burdened cost of either staff time or contractor support. Combined with the non-personnel costs discussed on the previous slide, total annual program costs are estimated at roughly $80,000 to $100,000. And finally, a few potential funding approaches if council chose to move forward. Staff are not proposing a specific funding source today. This slide simply outlines potential pathways council could consider if disclosure requirement were adopted. One option would be reprioritizing within the existing sustainability program budget, which would require adjusting or deferring some current work. Another option would be allocations through a future budget process. Third, council previously reviewed potential revenue options from the 2024 Revenue Advisor process, which looked at ways to support new or expanded city services, and that includes sustainability-related work. A summary of that broader discussion is included as attachment D in your AIS. In looking at other jurisdictions with disclosure requirements, it is worth noting that there is no silver bullet funding approach from those cities that staff found. Staff have learned that those programs are typically supported through existing resources or broader budget priorities, so approaches similar to those that are outlined here. And lastly, staff also continue to monitor external funding opportunities, state and federal grants, philanthropic support, and partnership opportunities. Those sources could help, but they are competitive and rarely provide long-term financial stability. To date, staff have also not identified a grant opportunity that would be well-suited to support this work. So ultimately, if moving forward, it would require identifying how a disclosure requirement would be supported. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Danielle to talk about potential regulatory frameworks and implementation.
Staff have provided a potential regulatory framework as attachment B, based on a review of home energy score disclosure programs adopted in other Oregon jurisdictions. This is intended to illustrate the elements commonly addressed in local disclosure regulatory frameworks. If council chose to proceed, an ordinance would reasonably be expected to address the topics listed here. Just to highlight a few, applicability would identify the types of residential properties subject to a disclosure requirement. Trigger event means which would specify when a home energy score must be obtained and disclosed. Typically, this is prior to public listing for sale. Compliance describes how the requirement is satisfied and how compliance is verified, including any procedures necessary to administer and enforce the requirement. Exemptions and waivers identifies property types, transaction categories, or other circumstances under which the requirement would not apply. Council directed the city manager to develop an implementation plan, and so we've broken down what implementation of the requirement could look like if council decides to proceed into the following 4 distinct phases. We are currently in the later stages of phase 1 and would need council direction to move into phase 2. And now I'll provide a bit more detail about each of these phases. Phase 1 has included establishing a foundation for the policy. We have done engagement to gather community perspectives. We've done research to consolidate the lessons learned from other jurisdictions. In my previous slide, I just highlighted some of the core structural elements that would be addressed in the regulatory framework. And as Ian discussed, we have estimated the staffing and resource needs to understand what implementation would entail. Phase 2 only proceeds if council directs the city manager to prepare draft language. Staff would return with ordinance language for council to review. A public hearing would be held, and then council may determine whether to adopt. Then the project would move into the administrative phase. So phase 3, program design. If adopted, this phase focuses on building the operational and administrative systems needed to carry out the requirement. Ian addressed some of this earlier, but this includes setting up the workflow, processes for compliance, enforcement, exemptions, coordinating with utilities, expanding the workforce of assessors, and developing outreach materials to educate sellers and real estate professionals about the requirement. Phase 4, implementation and evaluation. So once the program is implemented, there will be ongoing oversight. Staff would identify metrics and track data to evaluate the policy and include things like compliance rates, geographic distribution of scores, participation in related programs, et cetera. Staff periodically would report back to council, and evaluation would provide insight into program outcomes and inform any future refinements. So in summary, what a home energy score disclosure requirement is something that would expand awareness and understanding of home energy performance, opportunities for improvement, and available incentives. The policy is informed by research and best practices. It aligns with previous goals and priorities that council has established, as well as extensive engagement. Tonight, we have described the cost and potential options for funding this policy, and we have provided an overview of the regulatory framework for implementing the policy should council decide to proceed. At this time, we'd like to open it up. We are happy to answer questions that would inform your decision tonight, and with that, I turn it back over to the mayor.
Thank you, staff. Thank you both for that presentation, and I will now open up the floor for council discussion. I have Councilor Clark in the queue, and then Councilor Groves, and then Councilor Zelenka.
Microphone was already on there. Oh, wow. Thank you, Mayor. Did I understand you to say that you would be creating a database of results and people's scores and readouts for their analysis?
Yeah, so typically, the way the platform works is all of the scores that get created are published to something called the Green Building Registry, which is a publicly accessible and viewable site where you can view all of the scores that have been done in the area.
But it doesn't keep them it presents them in the aggregate, but it also presents them per individual home, yes?
That's correct. They're presented by individual home.
So if some future council decided some silly notion of mandating that people update their homes in some particular way, this would be the perfect list to start with, right? Sorry, you don't have to answer that question. It's kind of silly. If in fact this were a proposal for awareness, I'd be in favor of it, and I'd want to do it. If this were something that were voluntary and people wanted to have this tool for the purpose of making sure that their home sold for the most amount of money possible because they had the best available thing for sale, I think that would be a reasonable way for us to proceed. But the housing market in our community and all across the country, but certainly in our community, has two problems. We have a housing affordability problem, and we have a housing availability problem. This particular bit of work solves neither problem. It makes it worse. And so I can't be in favor of this at this time if it's mandatory, if we're going to insist that everyone experience this because we know best, then I don't believe I could be in favor of that because it would make housing more expensive at a time when we really don't need to be doing that. We need to be doing the exact opposite of making housing more affordable and more available to people. It's not like people have a choice of 27 different places they could choose to live based on the scores that are available if we do this. Usually, they have very few options, if any. So I don't think it's a good idea for us to proceed with this at this point, unless we want to make it an opportunity that's not mandatory on everyone. Thank you.
Counselor Groves.
Thank you, Mayor. Actually, I'm going to start with the question that Mike just raised. Why is this not voluntary? Why are we making this a mandated event?
That's a great question. We have had a voluntary program. People can voluntarily get a home energy score at any moment that they'd like to. It's something that anyone can do. They can call up an assessor and get a home energy score either when they're listing a home and selling a home or at any other time. With it being a voluntary program, we haven't seen very large uptake of it. I forget the exact percentage, but there's been very low participation with it being only voluntary. And we've also had a subsidized program, so if you're low income or if you're a renter, you have historically been able to get it for free. And even with that program, we still have seen very low uptake. So
How many people know about that program? What do we do to advertise this? What do we do to push this out into the public?
So the program that I mentioned that had offered the program for free, it was a partnership between the U of O and the City of Eugene and eWeb, and so there was joint communications around that. There was information put into people's eWeb bill about how they could get the score if they met the qualifications to get it for free. The information was listed on our website as well as the partners' websites, and throughout all of our engagement during our last two phases of engagement, so since 2024, whenever we were out tabling, we had information about it. So I wouldn't say we had the resources or time-wise and staff-wise to do an extensive campaign on it. I mean, that also takes time and money. But with the, opportunistic communications that we were able to do about it, we saw very little participation.
I've lived here for 46 years. I feel like I'm pretty involved in the community, and I'm out there a lot, even before I became a counselor. I didn't ever hear about this until it was brought to us. So I wouldn't say that it's widespread knowledge, which is, I think, a piece of this. Like Councilor Clark, I could support this if it were a voluntary program, especially if it were a voluntary pilot, and then we could come back, see what that did, and come back and look at it down the road. My concern is none of these things we add by themselves are that big of a deal, but it's starting to feel to me like it's a death by 1,000 cuts. We just have regulation upon regulation upon regulation. And from my observation, with our lack of our economy growing, living wage jobs, employers that are employing our population, we don't need to keep giving people reasons not to locate here. We don't need to keep giving employers that could come in and provide living wage jobs a reason not to locate here. So I'm concerned about this, and I'm concerned about a number of things that we're looking at right now. What does that do to the employment opportunities? And I always like to say, when we talk about affordable housing, the other side of affordable housing is living wage jobs. The other part of health in a community, poverty, people living in poverty statistically have shorter lifespans. And so we need to be lifting people out of poverty. We need to be providing good living wage jobs. We need to have a tax base that supports our service delivery system. And I'm just skeptical of anything that makes that more difficult. And I don't want to throw a wet blanket on things. Like I said, I'd be willing to go forth with a pilot program and see how it works, and start off with voluntary with some publication about this and see what that gets us before we go headlong into, nope, we're giving another edict from the dais. So that's where I am on this. Thank you.
Mayor, may I quickly
please.
respond? So
City
I just
Manager.
want to remind council, the reason this is coming to you as a requirement is because that's what was in the motion for us to bring back.
I understand that.
Thank you for that clarification, City Manager. I was going to offer a similar one if it wasn't covered in this round. Councilor Zelenka.
Well, voluntary systems don't work. That's why we shift them to mandatory. Pretty clear. In this case, the benefits far outweigh the costs of doing this. This is a long-standing policy option that we've been tossing around, as of other communities. This goes back to CAP 2.0. When was that? CAP 2.0?
2018 and 2019.
2018, 19. So we've been dealing with this for 6, 7, 8, 9 years. Time to move off and get going with it. Numerous other cities have adopted this already and very successfully. What's the list of cities that have done this, and how many home energy scores have there been in Oregon?
There's 4 cities that have done it, so Portland, Bend, Hillsborough, and Milwaukee, and 60,000 homes in Oregon have done it.
Right, so that's, and the research shows that it's not been a problem. It's not shown to make housing more expensive, because it's very low cost. It costs a couple $100 on a $250,000 or $500,000. That's nothing. You spend that more on closing costs. So it has not shown to be those things that people have been fearing in real life, as opposed to theoretically. So I think what this does is it provides very important information about operating costs of a home, which is really critical, because the operating cost is really associated with the livability and affordability that people have. And those are the 2 biggest issues we have in Eugene right now. And knowing how much your your house uses and how much it costs is critical in picking a house. This is just basic information, and it needs to be done on a large scale in order for it to actually work. So what does reprioritize existing sustainability program resources mean? What does that look like?
Thank you for that question, Councilor Zelenka. I think basically it means that staff capacity is finite. You're looking at the team. We're basically working at capacity, and
Do
so
great
if
work,
this was
by the way.
something that was going to, thank you for that. If this was something that was going to proceed, we would have to think about what we're doing right now and what would have to be de-emphasized or deprioritized to take on this responsibility.
Have other cities found that it really takes a half an FTE?
Yeah, that's basically somewhere between that. It's, there's some scalability for that, but they're finding that it's taking about that. Portland has a half FTE, plus they have contractor support on top of that. They also have more home sales per year.
Right. On the next steps, so this isn't an ask for a final decision, this is going down the steps, right? So the next step would be figuring out the regulatory framework, and bringing that back to us, and then program design after that, and then we'd make the final decision. So we're moving this process forward after 9 years into the next step, and I'm all in favor of that. Thanks.
Councilor Keating.
Mayor, I think Councilor Kaczynski had her hand up before me, if she would like, I defer.
Either of you. Councilor Kaczynski, would you prefer?
Rock, paper, scissors.
I will go ahead and go.
Go ahead, Councilor. Thank you, Councilor Keating.
Thank you so much for your presentation and all the work that you've done on this. I was looking through our packet from last time and trying to find, because the data that was associated with this was, I think, very robust. And I remember one of the things that we had talked about when this was brought to Sustainability Commission was about the availability of assessors to do the home energy score. And I think you had gotten some information about how many sort of FTE, for lack of a better word, of jobs would be needed to do all these scores.
Yeah, there's currently 4 assessors serving the Eugene area, and our research shows that in order to serve this policy with minimal disruption to the real estate market, it would require 16 to 20 full-time assessors.
Okay, and it sounds like if I'm remembering correctly from that previous meeting, when this policy went into place in Bend, they quickly scaled up from however many assessors they had before, which was like 2 to, the 20 or 30, 10, 20, 30 they needed. So it was actually creating economic opportunities for people in the community. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And I mean, in working with our researcher, it hasn't shown that gap of, not having enough assessors has been a problem. It has quickly kind of ramped up, and that can be further supported by the city, or staff or contractor support providing additional training to help ramp up that workforce.
Okay, and so that budget line item that was in the packet for the additional training is to help sort of people be able to do this professionally and have a job doing it?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. That was my main question. I think that, addressing our climate and addressing housing affordability, addressing people's ability to know about these programs and know what resources are available to them and kind of know what they're getting into, it requires, there's no like one big action that's going to resolve this, and this feels like one of the many small actions that we can take in order to incrementally address some of the challenges that we're facing as a city. So I appreciate all your work, and I look forward to seeing what the next phases look like.
Councilor Keating.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Danielle and Ian. I'm wondering in the other communities in Oregon, Bend, Portland, Hillsborough, Milwaukee, if business and industry, solar, for example, or windows, siding, companies that sell energy-efficient heat pumps or HVAC companies, if they see the long-term benefit for having a home energy score, has there been any engagement with the business sector around that piece in the aforementioned communities or here locally?
That's a great question. We had 3 different focus groups that included businesses as well as several one-on-one interviews, and many of those included, business owners of HVAC companies, residential general contractors, architects, so folks who are intimately involved with that type of, sector. And a lot of them viewed this as something that would help better educate their clients about the value of making energy efficiency improvements. They get a lot of people who come to them wanting a new kitchen or an addition on a house, and the client might not necessarily be aware of the value of, like, when you're doing that, well, now's a really good time to do insulation, or if you're going to be upgrading a piece of equipment, it's a really good idea to just get the more efficient one, even if those types of things are going to add a little bit more money to the overall cost of the project. And so a lot of those people who we talked to just viewed this home energy score, getting a home energy score in the hands of their future clients as something that would better be another way to educate them about the value of energy efficiency improvements.
Very helpful. Thank you. Ian, go ahead.
I was just going to add, I don't think we have numbers that have enumerated or monetized it, but there has been discussion in both Portland and Bend about this inducing demand for other trades and other activities that might not otherwise occur for doing things like weatherization, for doing things like installing solar panels. But they haven't put a dollar figure to it, but there is an estimation that does induce demand for some of that work.
Great. Danielle?
And just to be thorough in how I capture what we heard too, some of the concerns that were shared from some of those conversations were things like, this home energy scores tool doesn't seem comprehensive enough. Some of them thought, well, if you're going to do an assessment, you should do a really thorough assessment, like something like a blower door test or, a HERS score, which these are similar there are other energy assessment tools that are out there that are more expansive and also more expensive. So, there's trade-offs to doing that. But I think one reason that we've seen the home energy score tool become the standard across the nation with cities who are exploring this is it's something that is more affordable, and it's information that's not overwhelming to the client. And so, they can choose later on if they want to get a more expensive test or a more expensive assessment, but they don't have to be inundated with that information right away.
You mentioned that in other communities, there are lessons learned from other jurisdictions. What lessons have been learned?
There's been a lot of lessons learned. The foundation of our research was really looking at what has been observed, like what impacts have been observed in other cities that have these policies already implemented. We also looked at like what are best practices in terms of how to implement this with things like how to do enforcement, how to track compliance. So there's a range of lessons that were learned, and a lot of that is in attachment D, I think it is, and D and E, the policy memo, 2 policy memos that were attached. So I'm not sure if there's a more specific question around.
I mean, if there's just something off the top of your head that rises to the top of the crop.
I think the big takeaway is there's been minimal impacts in terms of homes. I mean, the big question I think that we had going into research was like, what's the impact on home sale prices? What are impacts on the real estate market? And what are impacts on climate? And I think for all 3 of those, the impact has been minimal. In terms like minimal home sale increases, very little disruption to the real estate market, and little climate impact from a disclosure-only policy, whereas the real climate benefit comes from when people actually make the recommended upgrades from the report.
No, I think the big thing that we wanted to do with the research was to better understand what were the observed systemic market impacts from this in these other jurisdictions. And as Danielle said, this is something where they're not necessarily seeing disruption. They're not seeing things that are changing in that front. And I think that's been the biggest thing that we wanted to learn from observed, actual implementation of this policy elsewhere.
In attachment D, you also alluded to various funding mechanisms that council has grappled with. Are there any that jump out to you as the most efficient or connected to this sector that we could explore? Because that's the next step for this body to grapple with should this pass today, and I hope it does. What funding mechanisms would you recommend are the easiest to implement that also are the most connected to this work?
Is a bit of a loaded term. I think for the options that were looked at through the revenue advisors process, those were all very large sums. And I don't think that any of them were necessarily right-sized for what this program would be. So I don't know that there's anything from that particular list that would make the most sense. So I think what that leaves is basically 3 options. It is something where we absorb this in some capacity with our existing program, and that means that other things are de-emphasized and we have less capacity for other things that we're trying to focus on right now, or this gets resolved through some type of future budget decision. And then we will continue to look for opportunities to partner, opportunities for grants, opportunities to find money, but that is not necessarily a stable funding source, so it's going to be one of those 3 that we'd be focusing on that I think is the most viable pathway forward.
All right, thank you.
Councillor Clark? Oh, Councillor Ye, I'm so sorry. I did not see your hand raised. Councillor Ye.
That's okay, no problem. All of my questions have been answered. Thank you to my colleagues for having such awesome questions. I'm ready to move this forward. I think I really appreciate staff's research that you brought forward. I think you just did a great job, well above what my expectations that I thought I was going to get. It was just out of the park. It's been very helpful, and this seems like really a critical transparency for buyers when we're making for most of us, what is our largest investment we will ever make. So, yeah, I guess that's it. I'm ready to move forward to the next phase. Thanks.
Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Mayor. Just one last question. In any of the 4 communities in Oregon that have implemented this, did your research show you a corollary decrease in energy use by any particular measure? Households that had good scores or whose scores were particularly high did or decrease in energy use overall by the community? Do you have statistics that this ended with a decrease in energy use because people knew this.
What comes to mind for me, actually, right off the top of my head, and I'll let Ian fill in after, is actually we have pretty local data with the program I mentioned earlier with eWeb and U of O, that out of all the homes who participated in getting a home energy score, they saw quite significant, well, they were able to measure the drops in kilowatt usage and BTUs from upgrades that they made as a result of getting the score. So they're directly from getting a score, you don't get any energy efficiency or reduction in energy use. But once you implement the recommended improvements, that's where you see the energy
Right.
savings.
What I'm looking for is, I would, for example, be willing to recommend, and I probably will when the time comes, a motion that this be voluntary as opposed to mandatory. So what I'm looking for is, if we insist that we know best and everybody must do this when they sell their home, then I'm looking for what should we expect as a decrease in energy use in the community as a result of that policy. And it sounds, and I'm not hearing we can expect a 5% energy reduction of use in our community or whatever number as a result of us making this mandatory.
So I appreciate that question, Councilor Clark, and I'm going to answer it in two ways. So this is a disclosure policy, so there's no...
It's a what, I'm sorry?
Disclosure policy. So there's no requirement to do anything that's on the list. And so first and foremost, any benefit you're going to get from an energy use perspective is for people who are willing to and able to actually undertake the actions that are recommended in the policy.
So it's voluntary if they do anything with the information
Right.
at all, at this time.
In all 4 cities. Yeah, there's no requirement to actually do anything on there. It's information
So
for
the
the
simple awareness doesn't help
I-
them.
I was going to answer, there's a second piece of this, and I will draw your attention to page 15 on attachment E, which is the research report. And there was an evaluation done by the Energy Trust of Oregon where they looked at uptake of recommendations that were in home energy scores, and I will quote this exactly. So on average, these 207 homes received $490 in incentives for upgrades that saved 477 kilowatt hours and 29 therms per year. So you can get energy efficiency reductions by taking advantage of both incentives and recommendations in these reports. But the key is taking advantage of what's actually recommended in the report.
Thank you very much. My larger point was, if what you do about the information is voluntary, it seems like gaining the information should also be voluntary, because if it's something that people want to know, we need to give them the tools to ask for it. But to make everyone spend money and do it makes housing more expensive. And we're saying essentially, we know better than you do what you should do. And I'm uncomfortable with that. Thank you.
Councilor Groves and Councilor Link are in the queue, but I'm going to insert myself at this point and just offer a few observations. And one of them is that I appreciate this coming back for discussion at council and in our community in the breadth of options that this body, that our city can make available to people to reduce energy consumption and save themselves money. This is an effective policy from what we have seen in other cities. And the timing of this policy at the point of sale is also one that makes a lot of sense. And I think in some of the comments, it may be misconstrued that this is a new requirement of all people in homes presently, but in fact, this is a point of sale policy action time, and I'm clarifying to you all, and you're both nodding yes, and that's clearly stated in all of our materials. So it's an opportunity at a sort of generational transition in ownership, or a short-term transition in ownership, but at a point of sale for people to learn more about how their home is performing, and then for that information to be available to future buyers. I have seen many times the energy score, bright yellow labels attached to singular appliances presented to a potential home buyer as a real sign of energy efficiency within a home. This score actually, I think, would be much more effective in terms of informing future homeowners, buyers, renters of housing in the future as we pursue that aspect of this work, what the actual energy efficiency value of their home is. So rather than $1 a month, because you have this range rather than that one, a bigger sense of where your energy consumption is going. And we've had many conversations in our community about the real challenges of transition to more renewable energy sources, and that transmission is a real challenge broadly when we look at the total numbers. So the opportunities to support conservation are incredibly important as we're thinking about meaningful progress with climate change. We have a lot of housing stock that was built in our community at a time when energy efficiency, insulation, infiltration were not primary concerns. They weren't primary concerns in the building code and the energy code. They were not primary concerns of people who are buying homes. This is an opportunity with a generational shift in ownership to upgrade the experience of the people who will be owning that home into the future and to affect potentially their affordability in a positive way. So I just wanted to offer that I think that there is, this policy, as observed by Councilor Kaczynski, is a very incremental step towards ambitious and important climate goals that we have as a community, but it is a very clear way to offer much more information to people in our community about the cost of the housing that they might be buying, and to have that be accurate information. And so I think in that way, it is of great value to our community. Councilor Groves and then Councilor Zelenka.
Thank you, Mayor. One of my big concerns too is I feel like the energy score, and first of all, I fully support reducing energy consumption. That's what we should be focusing on. At the same time, you take an older home, which a lot of our seniors live in, or you take low income, which a lot of our low-income people live in, or older construction with 2x4 stud walls on the exterior walls. You're never going to be able to bring them up to the same level as a 2x6 exterior stud wall in a wrapped house. And so I feel like it's going to be groups of people that are going to be most affected by this. But then my question is, going back to the U of O study you said, where it actually saw a decrease in energy consumption that was measurable in kilowatt hours used. Was that a voluntary or mandatory program?
The U of O program was a voluntary program.
So we made progress with a voluntary program.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Councilor Zelenka.
Well, I think it's helpful to be clear about requisite enabling programs that then enable greenhouse gas emission reduction actions like this program. The information is paramount to taking action, and which also, by the way, saves people money. And there are no mandatory weatherization programs anywhere in the country, and I've been in this business for 40 years. Come on, Mike, that's a scare tactic. There's not a single example where it happened, so I think it's a kind of a bogus point. Few things we do actually do save people energy and save them money, and especially in the energy world. And there's not very many things that happen that actually reduce people's cost of operating their house. Energy efficiency is one of those. The mayor just made that point very clearly. Most of the time I've seen in my 40 years in that business is that energy efficiency savings far outweigh the cost of doing it. So it's a smart thing to do once you get the information, but you have to have the information. So I think that what this does is it levels the playing field for all of the buyers that are in the marketplace that wouldn't otherwise be in a voluntary program. And we've seen very limited uptake in voluntary programs, which is why the ones that are successful are the ones that are required at sale.
And one correction, this policy it's at time of listing. So at the time a home is listed for sale. So I just wanted to clarify.
Thank you. And that would make it much more useful than at the moment of sale.
Yeah,
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, staff. I am now going to turn to our council vice president to put a motion forward.
I move to direct the city manager to prepare a draft ordinance to establish a home energy score disclosure requirement as described in the AIS, and to bring it to council for consideration at a work session.
Second.
Any further discussion from council? Councillor Clark?
I move to amend that to say a voluntary program rather than a requirement.
Second.
Thank you. Any further discussion from council? Councillor Clark?
Thank you, Mayor. I think Councilor Groves made the point adequately that when appropriately educated, folks with a high degree of interest, as many are, take advantage of the opportunity. eWeb already allows people to get information on their, their energy. I want to say electricity, but their energy use, their electricity use, and what the costs are over time with any house for free. What we're doing is mandating that a particular type of information be done by everyone. And Randy's point, I think, is adequate, that a voluntary program actually works and does the job, and a mandatory program that doesn't have any guarantee of success. The only thing it guarantees is that the buyer of a new house will have to pay a little more money, and that's it. That'll be the only part that's guaranteed.
Councillor Kaczynski?
Yes, thank you. I feel that staff and previous discussion has clearly articulated why having this be a requirement at point of listing has a much greater benefit than a voluntary program. I'm struggling to think how a voluntary program would differ much from what people can just do now, because we already have a voluntary program in existence. And as someone who was a first-time home buyer at one point, possibly more recently. Some of you may have bought into houses since I have, but some of you may not. And what I'll say is that, particularly for someone who hasn't bought houses before, who isn't in the market, having that information would have been very, very helpful. And I'm not sure that I would have known to ask for it at that point. And so I think having that being provided as part of the listing is very helpful for those home buyers. And so I do not have a concern about this being a mandated program. Thank you.
Councillor Keating, speaking to the substitution.
Speaking to the substitution, Mayor, I could only imagine generations ago if an imaginary council sat around a table discussing the merits of a voluntary odometer disclosure at the point of sale when you purchased your vehicle. It's illegal for car dealers, as I understand it, to even give misleading or false information around miles per gallon. It's a consumer protection piece. I see this direction as a 21st century consumer protection piece around our home energy, an actionable item that at the point of sale is information both beneficial to the buyer and to the seller. As someone who recently sold a home with my brothers, my mom's estate, I trust it would have been wholly informative for the prospective buyer, as it would have been for my brothers and I, to make the home that much more attractive as an energy-efficient 3-bedroom, 2-bath home. And as someone who rents in an energy-inefficient home and hopes to someday soon be a homeowner in Eugene, I would love for the next step for renters to have the right incentives in partnership with their landlords, a tenant-landlord relationship that provides the carrot and the stick for those home energy scores for the more than 50% of our community that rents. This is a great first step. And the fact that everyone is involved means it's then actionable, and the entire community will benefit. I urge a no vote on the amended motion and a affirmative on the main motion.
Now take a vote for this motion with its changes. Is there anything relating? I'm sorry, we're on to that point on the substitution. Is the motion that we are discussing whether or not it will be substituted. So we'll now take a vote on the substitution. All in favor? 3 votes in favor and all opposed. 5 opposed, and that motion fails. We'll now return to the original motion. Any further discussion from council? Seeing none, I'll now take a vote on this motion. All in favor? 4, 5, and all opposed. 3, and the motion passes with a vote of 5 to 3. Thank you, council. This concludes our first agenda item. Thank you, staff, for that presentation. Now turn to our city manager for our second agenda item today, which is a work session on the City of Eugene naming policy.
Thank you, Mayor. As you said, this is a work session on a naming policy update, potential for one at least, and we have Jason Diedrich from our city manager's office team here to present.
I have to turn it on. This is my first in-person meeting in 6 years, so happy to join you again. Take 3, my name is Jason Diedrich, Policy, Strategic Planning, and Performance Manager for the City of Eugene. I'm here today to give you an update on the city's naming policy, and conveniently, my slides are now ready. Quick overview of my presentation. We'll do kind of bring you up to speed on the history of the naming policy and what it entails, how it's been used recently by this council and by the organization, your council direction that you provided on how to update the policy with changes that you'd like to make. I'll then review at sort of a high level those updated policies and changes, and then you'll have time for discussion and potentially taking action on a resolution which would formally update the naming policy. So history of the policy was adopted in 2010 and it functions currently alongside other existing policy and guidance that we have internally for naming related to streets, parks, and libraries. You last revised the naming policy back in 2018, making a couple of small changes to the policy. However, you signaled that you would like to make a more significant changes to the policy, and so we're returning with that information today. So the existing policy is relatively straightforward. It has a very large kind of general guidelines preamble section, which was a bit of a part of the problem in that we had criteria for naming both in the preamble as well as in the body of the policy itself. And then essentially it had sections on criteria and process around both naming and renaming. So recent naming efforts that have utilized the policy or other internal guidance, renaming of Kesey Square in 2017, the renaming of Dr. Edwin Coleman Jr. Community Center, and the naming of Andrea Ortiz Park in 2018 utilized the policy. The downtown Riverfront Street renaming in 2019 also utilized our policy. I'll point out that was one of the very rare circumstances where we're naming streets in our community because they were new public streets, which we don't do very often. And then the renaming of Stryker Field to UMSO Park in 2024 also utilized the city's naming policy. Previous direction on this was to update the policy based on 4 broad areas. One was to clarify guidance on the naming criteria. The next was to clarify guidance on the naming process. This was to make it more clear both inside of the policy itself, but also to make it more clear to community members what the process would be around naming and renaming. You also asked us to update the policy to make it more inclusive, both in process as well as the criteria that would be utilized for naming. And then finally, to make structural changes to both streamline and simplify the policy. So I'll walk through each of these 4 areas at a high level for the changes that are in the policy. So the first was to clarify guidance on naming criteria, and you indicated to clarify because essentially much of the core criteria remains the same, it just needed to be made more clear. So as a reminder, there are 2 major ways to think about naming. One is to utilize geographic, natural, historical, cultural, or geological elements. Think of Wild Iris Ridge as an example, or something like Downtown Riverfront Park, where it makes it clear what's distinguishing about a site, or makes it clear maybe where a site is located so that community members can find the facility. And then also naming after individuals with criteria around things like character, community contributions, and potentially donor requirements or considerations. All of the criteria, as I mentioned, is now in the policy. There's almost no preamble to the policy, so it makes it very clear what's naming criteria and what isn't. So that's been a change, and also removed some of the redundancies in the policy. And then we also made changes to the criteria for naming after individuals, restricting it to individuals who have been deceased for 1 year or more. Secondly, you asked us to update around the process, particularly the community engagement process around naming. So there's now a new, clearer process, which I'll walk through in a minute. It also makes clear that council will approve each engagement process for a facility. So the city manager will propose an engagement process. You'll have the opportunity to comment on and approve that engagement process before it begins. There are 3 options that are sort of the basis for engagement that will occur with increasing level of engagement. These are intended as the basis for the city manager as they're putting together those engagement options, not necessarily having to stick strictly to them, but they provide a nice sort of backbone of expectation. So reviewing those options, the first, option 1, is where staff is doing research on names, and then there's engagement from an Okay. So the first option, sort of recapping, is sort of the most minimal amount of engagement. Staff would do research on names, and then engagement from an existing group like a neighborhood association or maybe a standing committee. You could think about this as something we would use for something like a natural area, where we're often coming up with names that are something about the geological or botanical features of a park or a natural area. Second option has an increasing level of engagement. This would include things like public meetings and surveys, as well as staff vetting of the names that emerge from that. This would be for facilities where there's probably interest from a segment of the community, but not the whole community. So think about a neighborhood park maybe as being an example. Using parks and natural areas as examples because that is the majority of the naming that the city actually does of facilities. And then the third option would include a more open public name submission process where all community members are open or invited in to submit names, staff vetting of those names, and then community voting. This we would use for facilities that have broad community interest across the communities. Think of maybe a metro or a community park. This is very similar to the process we use for the downtown riverfront streets, used a process similar to this. You asked us to update the policy to build inclusivity into both the process and the naming criteria. So now we have more inclusive language around naming after individuals, removing a little bit of language, opening it up around community contributions and what sort of makes an individual notable in terms of being considered for naming. We have now a much broader community engagement process that is not only broader, but it's more certain, so the community can have a better understanding of what to expect around the engagement. We're also now opening renaming up to all possible names. So in the past, a community member or a group could submit that or could suggest that a facility be named differently than how it's currently named, and they would often propose a new name. And the process typically revolved around considering only that new proposed name versus considering all possible names. And so now the policy is more clear that in a renaming process, it will simply trigger the same process as naming. So individuals or community members could submit a possible name for renaming, and that would be included and considered alongside any other names that community members might want to suggest. Also builds in involvement of key stakeholders depending on the types or specifics of names that are being proposed. And then finally, you asked us to streamline and simplify the policy. It is now 2.5 pages long versus 4.5 pages. So at the very highest level, it is now half as long as it was, with very little meaningful content removed. There's a lot of redundancy removed and a very long preamble removed. So we removed that preamble, the redundant language. There was language in the existing policy around other jurisdictions asking for your support around naming or for you making recommendations to other jurisdictions around naming. Because the policy is about naming of city facilities, those two things seem superfluous to the policy. They were also possibly too restrictive in their criteria for you around what you could do in those situations. So simply gives you more purview over what to do if you want to engage with other entities on their naming. It aligns the processes for naming and renaming, so they're essentially the same. That also made the policy more streamlined. And that's it, actually. So that was just kind of a quick high level. The policy is much shorter, more streamlined. Also makes it clear who has purview over what naming, so it makes clear, and it doesn't change this, but it makes clear that City Council has jurisdiction over naming of facilities and the city manager over sub-facilities or features. Think about things like bookshelves at the library or picnic pavilions or benches in parks. Those remain as they were with the city manager having the authority around naming for those or delegating that authority. It just makes it much more clear in the policy than it did previously. So I'll turn it back over to the mayor for questions, and you could potentially take action on this evening.
Thank you, staff, for that presentation, and I have Councillor Keating in the queue. Council, we also spent a little bit more time, I think time well spent, on our first agenda item today. So for rounds, I've asked staff to set the timer to 1 minute. I think we'll have plenty of time to get through discussion, but I want to be sure that we wrap up on time to prepare for our 7:30. So Councillor Keating.
Thank you, Jason. What's the thinking behind the year delay to posthumously recognize someone in the community with a naming convention, park, plaza, street, whatever?
Probably the most relevant thing I can say about this is prior to 2018, from 2010 to 2018, the policy actually specified that an individual be deceased for 2 years or longer. At the work session in 2018, where council made the most recent changes to the policy, there was the shift from 2 years to 1 year. So I can only speak to the fact that in that case, the desire of that council was that less time pass, 1 year instead of 2 year. I can't necessarily speak to the original intention back in 2010 in terms of why there would be a 1 year. There were a couple of councils here in 2010.
I'd love to hear them, because I'd like to eliminate that piece altogether. There's a good reason, great. And we're not restricted to 1 year for naming conventions if we want to recognize someone in the community who is with us. Is that accurate? Or they have to be deceased?
Correct, yeah.
That's too bad. That's too bad. I'd love to hear my colleagues' reason as to why. Because I've heard from community members, that this very plaza that I'm looking out over, just 50 yards from here, would be awesome to be heralded as the Kitty Piercy Plaza. But I wouldn't want to wait, hopefully, the many years until former Mayor Piercy would be able to enjoy such an opportunity and celebration of her legacy. So I look forward to hearing why there's a guardrail, for lack of a better term, of from 2 years down to a year. I would want the community to have the most flexibility to honor persons in our community who made the most contributions.
Councillor Yang.
Thanks so much. So thank you, Jason, very much. I may be in the minority, but I find this kind of policy work extremely interesting. So I appreciate you digging into this and bringing it back to us. I think these labels these names that we put on buildings that, we think of them as functional, as a way to find things, but they're a lot more than that. They're a visible public demonstration of our values and what we find important, and sometimes what we don't find important. Names of things, of parks, of buildings are not neutral. They're never neutral. And so, when we're making these decisions in our community, we're creating this collective memory, this collective culture of the things that we're going to memorialize in our community. And these choices that we've made in the past and we're going to make in the future, they can either celebrate our community, our entire community, or they can marginalize people, depending on how we make those choices and what we do with this policy. So I think it can be incredibly important. So thank you very much, Jason. So I had a few questions.
Councillor Ye?
Am I way over my time
Well,
already?
you just passed the 1 minute, and I'm happy to come right back around too. If you'd like to ask one question now, I'd be willing to
I will
extend.
wait. I will wait. It's okay. I'll let
Okay.
other people talk.
Okay, we will come back to you. Councillor Zelenka is ahead of you in the queue, and if no other council would like to speak, we'll be right back to you.
Sure, the reason that we have the waiting period after someone dies is basically it allows time to vet that person through social media and other news sources, but allow that person's legacy to get fully fleshed out. It's often not the case immediately after someone dies that things could come out. So the reason we moved it from 2 years to 1 year is because 2 years seemed like too long, but 1 year seemed sufficient. Got that about right? Yeah, and the reason we don't allow living people is because that just inherently becomes too political. People who are, not that dead people aren't political, but it'll become much messier if we did it for living people. I had a question about the options for engagement. How does that work to select one? Or in that process that you've outlined.
So,
Much appreciated streamlining.
Sure. So staff will notify the city manager and council that there's an upcoming naming opportunity. City manager will work to develop an appropriate option in terms of engagement based on the nature of that facility. So kind of size, where it's located, taking into consideration the potential level of community interest. This would be the same for renaming as well. And so would start with these three options as the basis to bring forward based on essentially the size, potential interest in the facility. So that would sort of guide which of these options would come forward. Again, there's possibilities for hybrid options, but then city manager would present that rationale for why that option was chosen to you as part of your process of reviewing and approving the engagement process.
So they're mutually exclusive. So there would be one of them picked.
Correct, yes, there would be one engagement process picked, yes.
Councillor Evans. Oh, yes, City Attorney.
I need this.
Yes.
I just wanted to point out that the word choice in the policy is intentional, that the city manager shall base engagement on one of the following three options described. So that it would be option one, but it could be option one with a few features from option two. The manager has the ability to base it on these, but maybe for a particular reason, also include the stakeholder group or.
Thanks.
Councillor Evans.
In the same vein as what Councilor Zelenka said, I look at this as the Joe Paterno rule, that, if you start naming names after buildings or whatever, after people who are alive, then the denaming process becomes a lot more difficult if something comes up in that individual's background that is untoward or has implications that we don't want to underscore out there. It's like naming something after Jeffrey Epstein and then finding out that Jeffrey Epstein is not the person you want to name it after. So, And do we have, the question is, do we have a denaming process?
We have a renaming process that is specified in the policy. I guess that would be the closest thing to I mean, if you mean denaming by taking away a name and then there is no name, we don't specifically address that in the policy. What we do address is the potential to rename.
Counselor Ye.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, I had a few questions, Jason, if I'm reading this right. So I'm gonna start with naming it after people. I know we had a conversation about the experience with UMSO, where we had several names that were recommended that were somewhat popular that didn't fit the criteria as we were interpreting it as extraordinary service or gift to the community because they were not local people. So for example, one of them was Marsha P. Johnson, clearly a large national figure in the trans community, and has an impact on the community in that way, but not someone who's local. So I'm wondering if with these changes, the way I read it, that maybe there might be cases where someone like that or someone like Martin Luther King Jr. might qualify or no?
The section of the policy that I'll direct your attention to would be under section 1, I guess subsection 2C, section 1. Made achievements and contributions that represent a lasting legacy to the mission of the city of Eugene and the community it serves.
Yeah.
There can be a fair bit of interpretation there around what someone who doesn't currently reside in the community may have done, or the legacy of that individual and what it means for our community that may be separate from whether or not they live here. So I think policy does open that up for that.
I wanted to make sure that's how I was reading it also. So
Counselor Ye, I'm going to start another round for you just right now because you're the only counselor in the queue, but I just want you to know.
I only have one more question, I promise. So, okay, so also Jason, or maybe two. Under streets, it says that there are, one of the requirements is they cannot be potentially confusing foreign sounding names. I don't feel that's very inclusive. And to be perfectly honest, I would take it out if it was me. And I was just wondering if you could speak on that one.
Counselor Ye, I think you may be looking at the current policy instead of the
Is that one out?
proposed policy at attachment B on page 71.
Oh, I thought they worked together. I'm sorry. Okay, so that one's gone. So great. So that's great. Okay, so Jason, last question is, I'm wondering if in all of this work I don't think you did, but did you have an opportunity to think about our current situation, the things that are named in our community and how we're doing in the areas of, like having an inclusive, I don't know, landscape of names that are, in our community?
It was not something that was specific work that we did. However, I can say that the Human Rights Commission does have a work plan item that relates to a previous council resolution that you passed, as well as sort of with the potential work being what they're working on, taking a look at names around our community for potential renaming, as well as thinking about if there are opportunities for naming that we want to do. So the HRC, Human Rights Commission, does have that on their work plan.
Excellent. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Counselor Ye. Going to pause for a moment.
Like I can make an almond cheese sandwich, like grilled cheese sandwich with almond cheese.
We are live again.
Thank you, Roshan Chairs, for helping us with that technical difficulty. I'm now going to turn to the council vice president to put a motion forward.
Can I turn on my mic?
Ceiling
It's your
microphone.
own.
All right.
I can't hear, that's why.
I move to adopt the resolution adopting a naming policy for the city of Eugene at attachment B to the AIS.
Second.
Any further discussion from council?
D or B?
Councilor Keating?
I'll be a yes, but not to be a wet blanket. I think that we should, a future council should have a more serious conversation about giving this body the ability to do what other communities like San Jose or Los Angeles have done by naming mechanisms after persons who are alive and have had made an historical impact. Barack Obama comes to mind. So I would like more flexibility, but I'm not gonna gum this up, so I suppose I'll be a courtesy yes. But I just wanted to underscore my enthusiasm for this or a future council to have a little more flexibility.
Thank you, city attorney.
I'll point out a similar thing to what I mentioned a few minutes ago. Within the resolution itself, we did include a provision that makes this mandatory unless the city council determines extraordinary circumstances call for an exception.
Thank you.
Thank you, city attorney. Councilor Clark.
City attorney, I just wanna make sure I'm on here. Okay, remind me if I'm correct, but it is the case that any regular council ordinance to name an item may be reviewed by petition or is subject to review by petition by the voters. Am I correct?
It would be if it was done by an ordinance, but that's generally not how it's done.
Not generally speaking, I'm saying if the council unanimously agreed, we wanna name something in a certain way, but a bunch of people in the community disagreed, they would still have the option to file a petition to reverse the council's decision. Am I correct?
Not in all cases, but they can obviously come and ask you about it and urge you to make a change during your public forum at any time. But for example, if you just passed a motion or a resolution, it's not subject to the same sort of.
Right, but ordinance is, right, exactly.
Yes.
Alright, thank you.
Any further discussion from council? Seeing none, now take a vote for this motion. All in favor? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And the motion passes with a vote of 8-0. Thank you, council, thank you, staff, for your support with technical challenges and for the presentations today. This concludes our agenda. And I now close the March 9th, 2026 City Council Work Session. We are adjourned.